Hey, do you have to deal with the CBAM reporting? In this podcast episode, I'm going to talk to Gabriel Rozenberg, who is an absolute expert with the CBAM topic and whose company is building a database for all different CBAM data. So if you're curious about the topic and want to learn a little bit more about the CBAM regulation and who is it going to affect, then you should definitely listen to this podcast episode. Enjoy. Welcome, Gabriel. And first of all, thank you so much for taking the time. For those people that don't know you yet, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What have you been doing? What are you doing right now? And how did you get here?
Sure. So I'm Gabriel Rozenberg. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a startup called Cbamboo. And Cbamboo is building the operating system for the world's carbon border taxes. We are completely focused on a new kind of regulation, which is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That's something that's been introduced by the EU. We think it's the first of many future CBAMs. We think it's a really exciting new system, and we've built our whole startup around it. In terms of how I got to be doing this, I've had a rather varied career, or even set of careers, you might say. Always based in the UK, grew up in London, and I started my career as a journalist. I studied politics, philosophy, and economics. I got involved a little bit in politics. I worked as a director of a hedge fund for many years. 2 years ago, I had a bit of a rethink of my life. I tried to put all of this together and come up with something new because I'd always wanted to build something. And when I was working in finance, there wasn't really the ability to create anything very new. And I was very, very keen to do something in the impact space. I wanted to work on climate change because I think it is the world's biggest problem. And it is also one of the few major problems in the world that anyone can get involved with being a solution for. And I was looking for businesses that could scale rapidly to have a serious impact on climate change, business ideas. And when I met my co-founder, Daniel Sharp, a year ago, he and I started looking at the enormous amount of regulatory change that's coming and just thinking about the power of that to affect corporate behavior and the amount of help that businesses would need in order to make sense of those new kinds of regulations. And we became particularly interested in the CBAM. So that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Okay, super interesting. I definitely have some more questions regarding the CBAM topic, but before we dive into that, I would be really curious to how or why did you decide for the sustainability topic? As you said, it's like a super big problem and it's very challenging, but I would also guess that it's maybe not the easiest topic to build something up. So where did the interest for you come from?
So I suppose I've been interested in politics and political debate and in economics. I used to write about economics for the Times newspaper when I was a journalist. And I probably dismissed the seriousness of the climate emergency, which was no secret to me. We've all known about it for decades. I think I probably assumed that it was something that was either exaggerated or it would all be sorted out somehow. And about 5 years ago, I started reading some writings by a financier called Jeremy Grantham, who is one of the world's most successful investors, but also at a time when this was much less fashionable than it is today. He came out very strongly in saying that his entire fund was essentially a climate fund, that he was 100% invested in the idea that the climate emergency is going to transform, our response to the climate emergency will transform everything. And he also put all of his personal philanthropic efforts into tackling climate change. And that really made me take that very seriously because he was working in the same field as me and is one of the kind of gurus of the investing world that I looked up to. And I started reading what he put together. And I think everybody has a different ways of coming to a kind of, you know, astonishment at the scale of the problem that is the climate emergency. It creeps in different fashions, but for me, that was going on about 5 years ago. I
Mm-hmm.
understood that this was, in economic terms, a problem of a stock rather than a flow. That is to say that even if we manage to really slow down the rate at which we are emitting into the atmosphere, then all that means is that we are adding an extra layer of insulation each year that is slightly thinner than the ones that we used to add, right?
Mm-hmm.
Each year we make the problem worse. And if we were to absolutely stop, which we will do one day, we would still have all of the carbon that we put into the sea that will be gradually escaping into the atmosphere over the coming decades. And so we don't just have to reduce emissions. We have to get emissions to zero and then somehow figure out how we're going to take out the carbon dioxide that's in the sky. And how much carbon dioxide have we put into the sky? Well, it's about 2.4 trillion tons. And, that's been pointed out is greater than the weight of every physical thing we've ever constructed on the planet and all of the planetary animal landmass and all of the plants and all of the trees. The weight of carbon dioxide in the air is unbelievably large, and it is mankind's greatest physical achievement. And it's been catastrophic, and it is going to continue to be catastrophic all our lives. And so you look at that and you have a moment of despair, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
and then you say, well, you know, is there going to be a future? I expect there will be a future. Are we going to get into a situation where we just ignore this and keep ignoring this? Well, we've done a lot of ignoring it, but eventually it becomes unignorable. You have to say to yourself, there's somewhere between pessimism and optimism here where you say, no, I'm not going to be too optimistic and I'm not going to be too pessimistic. I'm going to say there's work to be done. And try and
Mm-hmm.
find a niche for yourself in that whole piece of work that is going to be multi-generational. And I think if you're working on the problem, you can't feel too bad about the problem.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a good point to slowly introduce the CBAM topic. I would be interested to know or to see your opinion on how what you're doing right now with CBAM is affecting the problem that you just explained. Like, how is this fitting into the bigger picture?
So your listeners might not be aware of what CBAM is. So I'll just try to
Mm-hmm.
give you a 60-second summary. CBAM is the natural complement of the carbon price in any jurisdiction. As such, it's a really core idea that just hasn't been tried until now. Carbon prices are the best way economically we have to get to net zero by giving everybody incentives to cut emissions. But there is a problem. If you have a high carbon price in one region, then you get carbon leakage, which is not leakage of material into the atmosphere. It's the economic leakage of business going elsewhere, of people within Europe, say, buying from outside Europe, where actually the carbon restrictions are worse. So in order to do that, you have to say, well, let's see what carbon price has already been paid by those goods, and then top it up with a charge at the border. Okay, and that top-up charge is the carbon border
Mm-hmm.
adjustment mechanism. It levels the playing field between buying internally within Europe, where there is a carbon price, and buying from outside Europe, where there may be lower or zero carbon prices. Well, that is going to incentivize a lot of people to decarbonize. But before we get there, we have to acknowledge that this is a very sort of exciting idea in an economic textbook, a very, very challenging idea in the real world to implement,
Mm-hmm.
because we need to know how much embedded carbon there is in the products coming in on a ship. And as you know, embedded carbon is an abstract term. The carbon dioxide is in no physical way embedded. It's already been emitted. So what you really need to
Mm-hmm.
do is a massive data gathering exercise to figure out if you've got a ton of steel sitting in a shipyard in Rotterdam, who emitted the carbon dioxide and how much carbon dioxide did they emit in order to bring that steel into the world? And that is very difficult because we simply don't have that kind of traceability in place today. So the EU has basically required, as of the creation of this new law, which is being phased in and is now in effect, the EU has required importers to go and ask their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers for all the data that's needed to make that calculation to tax that carbon. And that's great, but companies just don't have that data. And so they're going to have to ask their suppliers for some data. And the suppliers say, well, what do you need? What do you need? And the importer says, well, I don't really understand it either. I mean, I've got all these requirements. It's an EU documentation. And the supplier says, I'm not even the person who made the steel. I just supplied it. It came from a different factory. I don't typically tell you which factory it came from, right? All of this stuff has got to be unpicked and figured out before we're going to be able to figure out exactly who emitted the carbon. And it's a good idea. It's a good system because we do have to have accountability for everybody who is emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But it will take a lot more than just a regulation requiring it. It's going to take software. We think that there needs to be software in the middle to help businesses talk to their supply chain, get the information out of them that they need. And we think it's going to take quite a lot of innovation. And so that's what we're doing at Cbamboo is we're trying to build a system for all of the supply chain to actually start collecting this data, sharing it with the appropriate people, and ultimately for businesses within the EU to take that data and then use it to file their CBAM reports. And that's great, but that's actually just the first step because the idea of the CBAM is to change people's behavior. So once we've helped people with their compliance needs, our long-term goal is to help them with their procurement decisions and help them to choose which are the suppliers which have the lower carbon systems, because those they will have an incentive to buy from because they will be lower tax. But again, it's not going to be simple. It's going to require a great deal of data on all sorts of businesses around the world. And so that's what we're building in the long term.
Okay. Yeah, super interesting because I was about to say like the concept of CBAM sounds super helpful and super necessary, but the sheer complexity of getting all the data and then making it available sounds very, very challenging. And especially like we are talking to a lot of companies that are new to the sustainability regulations that don't know how all this plays out. So they are standing in front of a jungle of different regulations and the jungle is still growing and changing. So for a lot of companies to just understand that it's super challenging. The whole process of the CBAM, who actually does this apply to? Like what companies need to be aware of this and read a little bit more into that?
Yeah. Well, so the EU is the first place which has created a CBAM. So we're talking here about EU CBAM. And they have decided, there are many different ways that you can choose to organize a CBAM. There are different sort of design choices you can make. The EU has decided to start with about half of the embedded carbon that comes into the EU and that is represented by the more kind of basic goods end of the spectrum. So, in an ideal world, you'd get a car coming in on a ship and you'd say, okay, this car has got so much embedded carbon. In practical terms, it's simply impossible to do. It's far too complicated to calculate at the moment. So instead, we're talking about basic materials. And the EU the big one is going to be iron and steel. If you are importing anything made of iron and steel, any kind of basic iron and steel and or kind of more complex products, then you're going to face a CBAM charge. They've set the threshold very low, 150 euros. So a lot of ordinary businesses are going to be caught up in it. The next one is probably cement. And then you have fertilizer, you have aluminium, and then slightly more special cases, hydrogen and energy. And we're very focused on the physical products, and we are particularly focused as a result on the iron and steel industry and the aluminium industry, because those industries are going to be transformed by CBAM. And they are, if you like, pioneers of this new system. But their products are bought by dozens of different industries. And so if you're an importer of, if you're a manufacturer and you happen to occasionally import a bit of steel goods, some screws and some wire or something like that, then you're going to have to fill in a CBAM declaration, just like you do your other taxes. And you might not even know about it yet, because I think understanding of CBAM is still early stage, despite the Commission's best efforts. Other jurisdictions will come in with a different lineup of goods. So the UK is consulting now on bringing in a CBAM in 2027. And they aren't going to include electricity. They are going to include the other products I mentioned, and they're also going to include ceramics, which is like bricks and tiles, and glass. There's no particular logic to it. What is going on here is that countries are trying to figure out how they can, as much of the embedded carbon as is reasonably possible based on today's ability to analyze the data. I think the long-term future, though, is for every physical product to essentially have a kind of product carbon footprint, something we're quite familiar with at this stage. But when they're traded products, and then there's a charge based on the carbon associated with them, then we're going to get in a very exciting world, because there are going to be product level carbon prices associated with all the goods that cross borders. So, I mean, one way to talk about what we're doing at Cbamboo is we're building a database of carbon prices. Well, if you say that, people think, oh, but we have carbon prices. We've had a carbon price in the EU since 2005. And so it's not that, right? That's a carbon price that is paid essentially by a particular factory. And it doesn't enter into the wider economy, right? Because that price isn't attached to the goods specifically in any way. But the CBAM, which starts from the same sort of system as the ETS because it's connected to it, because you're having to do it for every single good as it crosses the border, you can't be tree specific. You have to be good specific. Because of that, those prices are attached to the individual goods, and the CBAM charge could sort of be absorbed by anyone in the chain, right, from buyer to seller, okay? It could be the end customer, not just the importer. It could be whoever the importer sells to, or it could be pushed back to the producer, right? But somebody's going to pay it. Everyone's going to care. Everyone's going to care about these product level carbon prices in the future. And I think that once the EU has made this work, which I think is going to be a bumpy ride, but I think they will manage it, there will be other jurisdictions bringing in CBAMs, and you'll see these product level carbon prices anytime any physical product crosses a border.
Okay. That's a super interesting outlook for CBAM. And I personally, I've looked into the EU regulation, but I've not seen the bigger picture behind that. For companies that are in the process now of figuring it out and also then working with CBAM, can you can we draw from the experience that you made so far and maybe talk a little bit about challenges that now arise for companies?
Yeah.
Because the whole concept with all the data included is a very big chunk of work. So I would be very interested in hearing your opinion about what the challenges for companies nowadays are.
There's no question it's challenging right now, for sure. I mean, if you are trying to comply with CSRD, which you know a lot about, Daniel, you essentially have the information, and where you don't have the information, you can estimate the information, right? CBAM sets a more tough standard. They say the CBAM system says, no, you can't do any estimates here, or you can do a bit of estimate, but essentially it says you're going to have to go to the source. You're going to want to go to the
Mm-hmm.
source, right? Because if you have a factory in Indonesia or whatever that's reduced its emissions, then they should get credit for that. But they're going to have to tell you about it, right? If you want to be paying less tax, you're going to have to get data from them. You can't just estimate it. You can't say, oh, well, typical factories in this region have such and such. Well, that would miss out on the fact that there are factories out there that have lower carbon emissions. So rather than collect the data yourself, you have to ask for the data from other companies. And the challenge there is there are many different reasons why it's challenging. First of all, companies don't know necessarily how to collect carbon data. They haven't done it before. Secondly, the EU has set up a different carbon accounting standard for CBAM than exists for other data collection exercises, right? So they haven't used the concept of scope 1 and 2 and 3. They've talked about direct and indirect emissions. They exclude transport costs. They require certain additional data points. It's all the same kind of thing of carbon accounting. It's all measurement of what goes in and what comes out of your factory, but it's sufficiently different that you have to kind of look at this from scratch, even if you're quite sophisticated. And obviously, the other thing is that many of the factories that have produced these products are small, right? And until now, they have not had to find people they have not had to employ people who are sustainability experts or anything of that sort. So they haven't had the resources to do this. They haven't needed to. And suddenly they're being asked to essentially build the same kind of advanced monitoring that might exist in a large European supplier. And that's a big step up for them.
Mm-hmm.
Another reason why we don't see information come through is that companies might have solid business reasons for being cautious around sharing it. And this is something that the Commission needs to navigate with a lot of care and thoughtfulness, because when you share sustainability information in the commodities world, you are sharing information essentially about the amount of fuel that you've used and other variable resources, which is pretty much the only variable. Like, to really simplify the situation, it's pretty much the only
Mm-hmm.
variable that your customer can't model themselves, because they kind of know what your raw material costs are going to be. So if you then tell them how much energy you've used, they can work out how much you paid for energy. Well, where's your ability to put a margin on it if you have that much transparency over your production process? Now,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any particular way around it. You know, as an environmentalist, I'd say it's important that everyone who is involved in emitting carbon dioxide has some level of accountability for that. And that's not happened in human history before, but it's definitely what we need going forward. So I would say there needs to be a change. There needs to be that transparency, but I'm not, I'm not hiding from the fact that that is a very substantial disruption and challenge to a lot of business models. If you're a producer in Asia, it may be that the European market power, which is essentially what the Commission is relying on, doesn't look so great. You might say, well, 95% of the people buying from me are not in Europe, so I'll just ignore the request for data from Europe completely. I'll just get customers elsewhere. Now, we still simply don't know how this is all going to work. But so far, what I see is a lot of delaying, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of hesitation, a lot of delaying where I think that what's really going on is a complete reluctance to share information. And very occasionally people just saying upfront, well, if that's the information that's required, I'm simply not going to supply it. And if you want to stop buying from me, then fair enough. You know, that does occasionally happen.
Mm.
I think that other industries, although it's not my area of expertise, the food industry has got a great deal more traceability, right? My understanding is that if there's some sort of shipment of uh, milk that's got turned out to be bad, then it can be traced right the way through into all the products that milk has gone into, right? So that those products
Mhm.
can be recalled if necessary. Um, I don't think that the commodities world has got anything like that level of traceability at the moment in place. Certainly not when it comes to carbon emissions. And I think it's going to take time for businesses to get used to the idea that this kind of data creation and sharing is a necessary process, and that their business models may have to adapt. But in the meantime, I think it would be helpful if the regulators also understood that this isn't straightforward for businesses, and it's not just people being being obstructionist for the sake of it. That it's difficult for their business model to put this information out there.
Yeah. No, I completely get that the transparency is a big challenge, and it also shows in the conversation with companies that are trying to understand what CBAM is about, and once they're starting to understand what is required by that. Like this is just like a huge task and a lot of work. Um, Maybe also from the work that you're doing, what are some recommendations and tips that we can give to those companies that are now in the process? Like, how do you work with companies? Like, what do you recommend them to do? How do you help them to make the first step so that they are moving towards the right direction?
So we try to help them first of all by making a big effort to understand their needs. First of all, so there's no one
Hmm.
size fits all. Um, we've been doing a lot of customer discovery over the past year. We're still doing it. We still think of ourselves as in the pilot customer stage. And if you,
Hmm.
uh, if any of your listeners want to book a call with me, they can go on our website, cbamboo.com, and click book a call, and we'll have a nice conversation. And I'll be very interested to learn what people's experiences of the CBAM. What we're
Yeah, if
trying
you
to
can send that to me afterwards, then I can put it into the show notes. That would be good.
absolutely what I what are we trying to do for our customers? We think that the concept of sharing data from peer to peer absolutely has to have some kind of network solution. By which I mean, we are not going to get this data out of the supply chain by emailing someone who then emails someone who then emails someone, and then for it to all cascade back again. What if any of those links in the chain decides to be a bit slow? Says, "Oh, you need this by the end of the quarter? Okay, I'll have it to you by the end of the quarter," right? But then they're holding up the whole chain. What if any
Mhm.
of these links in the chain makes a mistake? Very standard. How can they make a correction? Are they going to email everyone and say, "Sorry, new numbers"? Are those people going to email everybody and say, "Oh, new numbers"? No. Okay.
Mm.
So the whole concept that the European Commission has put together is around essentially data gathering peer to peer and sharing peer to peer. And I think that that is something we can definitely improve on, right? And we can improve on that by having a network on which each operator has a page with their data that they are guided through the process of creating, that the data is then stored privately by default, and that they choose who to share it with. And where there are corrections and updates and new information, it's updated dynamically. We can do that with software. It's conceptually straightforward. And that's what we're building. But we're really at the start of this. So right now, for our customers in Europe, we are sort of acting as their intermediaries. We're going out to their suppliers and saying, "Can you provide this information? Um, Here is the format in which it needs to be put together. Here are some of the reasons, here's some of the thinking behind it." And we're learning from that. We're doing, like Paul Graham says, we're doing things that don't scale. and we're learning a ton from that. And we're going to have a software version of that up and running extremely soon. But we're probably still going to be doing quite a lot of, you know, uh, on the ground hand holding to get people up the learning curve, because there's an awful lot of companies out there that need to get their heads around this system and figure out how they're going to respond.
I would be curious to know, like in a typical process, like how much time goes into the whole collection process and the data process, knowing that it's not a one-time process that is then done and never has to be touched again. But like what could companies calculate, or the companies you have worked with, how long did they need to, or do they need to like start getting the data together?
Yeah, I don't have yet a kind of person hours measurement.
Hmm.
I think that if you have already done some work to analyze the emissions intensity of your business, then it should not take you too long. Ultimately, it is about collecting and calculating how much of various different emitting products you have brought into the factory, and how much is, less what's left over at the end of the year. It's a once a year process for the non-EU operator to put this information together. You then have a set of emissions factors, right? 0.2 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of steel. Those emissions factors
Hmm.
are multiplied by the amount of product that your customer buys, right? So you give those numbers to your customer. The actual amount of information that you have to send is relatively short. Um, it's not that difficult, but there's a whole procedure to go through. Um, we think that the challenge is around, as I said, it's all around the supply chain. It's about getting the right way to have a dialogue through the supply chain around carbon, um, because the actual process for the factory, that's not going to be too difficult for any one organization that is committed and keen. It's just a question of whether they will get used to the idea of sending that information at all.
Hmm. Okay. Oh, super interesting. Mm, I have one last question I would like to ask you. What would be the one thing that you want people to take with them from this conversation about CBAM? Because I feel like we touched on so many different things, and CBAM is certainly a big topic. So if we would have to put this in one thing, one sentence that people can take with them and share in the next meeting when they know that they have to focus more on CBAM.
I'd say CBAM has a technocratic name, but it's a very, very ambitious, even transformational new regulation. And if
Hmm.
you think your business is affected by it, I encourage you to be working now on how you're going to meet the challenge that it will bring about, see that it could create for your business.
Okay. Perfect. Um, Thank you very much for all your input and for all your expertise. It was really informational. Is there anything that I maybe have forgotten to ask or that you would like to mention as well?
Um, no, I mean, I'd love people to follow our story on LinkedIn. We post a lot of information there. And I mean, we're just very open. We are a startup. We have a very small team at the moment. We're growing fast. We are keen to learn and to improve. So I welcome conversations, dialogue, debate, discussion. You can find me on LinkedIn. And as I said, if you think you might be interested in what we're doing on a professional level, you're welcome to book a call straight from my website.
Okay. Perfect. I will definitely make sure to link all your LinkedIn pages and links below the episode so that
Thank you, Danny.
people can find you easily. And yeah, thanks again for all the time and for all the input.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for this opportunity.